Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very grateful to as well to the Scottish devolved administration. A bit gutting for us in Wales. You're a bit ahead of us now, so it's a bit of a gutting thing. But we'll catch up again. But it's from your Celtic cousins in Wales. Obviously, we're very, very pleased by what's happened. And again, any lessons and experiences we can share with yourselves, please ask us, because we should all be working together on these sorts of issues. Okay, as Charles said, I'm going to try today to give some sort of, if I can share my screen, a bit of an overview of what we've been looking at in Wales. And certainly what I want to try to do is not give you some sort of definitive statements around what's happening in Wales, but some reflections. And partly that's coming from me talking with youth justice providers in Wales, some of our education providers, and getting people's experiences. I mean, as we're probably all aware, there's a bit of a paucity of evidence at the moment around what COVID has done, but there are certainly child rights implications for the crisis. Charlie, can I just check? Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can, yes.
Great, thank you. Right, okay, so Charlotte has very kindly introduced me. I'll just give you a little bit more information about me. Today isn't about me, but I'll try and give you some context where I come from in terms of children's rights. I am a member of faculty here in Swansea. I'm a member of the law school and also the criminology department. And my background actually was in the area of children and people's policy. My first main job was as a policy officer in local government, taking forward issues around participation charters and getting children involved in local governance. And since then, my career has sort of intensified in the area of children's rights and youth justice. First of all, working with Swansea Yacht as Youth Justice Research Officer. And at the moment, I'm currently the criminology coordinator for the Observatory on the Human Rights of Children. And also within my department, I lead the Innovative Youth Justice team. And I also lead the school's research partnership within criminology. So a lot of what I do is working with those people who work with children, make policy for them, or who try to make a difference for them, either by advocating for them or by seeking change in legislation. So I thought it might be useful for me to give you a little bit of a background there. So as I say, what I'm going to try and do today is focus on what's actually happened during lockdown, reflect on experiences, and just see how this disruption has created challenges, but also some really interesting opportunities. Now, for those of you in Scotland, I think it's important as well I explain how things work in Wales. You guys are relatively lucky in that you have a much clearer devolution settlement than we do. Scots law is a matter for Scotland, your justice system is a matter for your parliament and your government. That's not the case in Wales. So what do we have? I'll move from the left to the right very quickly. We obviously have a devolved parliament and government. And one thing that has been quite significant and noticeable since devolution occurred in Wales is that there's been a very clear emphasis on the rights of children and action to protect their well-being. I will come on a little later and say this, that welfare is not a dirty word in Wales. It might be in other parts of the UK, it's certainly not in Wales. We have a fine tradition of wanting to support children and providing appropriate interventions where we need to. But one of the things that doesn't exist in Wales is competence around criminal justice legislation. So at the moment, all matters relating to criminal powers and the courts and that area of jurisdiction is a matter for the Westminster Parliament with, as I'll explain later, a little bit of blurriness around what happens in youth justice. As far as Welsh local government's concerned as well, again, we're in a really weird position in many ways. The Crime and Disorder Act of 1998 was effectively founded on trying to find local solutions to local crime problems. So local government played a very significant role in organising what happens on the ground. And I will come back to that again, because it's quite distinctive in Wales. And then also, and this is a point of contention for me, I hold my hands up and say I'm a bit pedantic about this. We've got services such as schools. Now, I come from a school of thought, which is one where I don't necessarily see youth justice as being criminal justice. I think this is a much wider argument, certainly in the context of the convention. You know, we have to look at interconnectedness. Justice doesn't sit apart from social services, from education, from health, from all these other rights. And so I put schools here because in many ways, they are some of the best preventers of crime that we have. And certainly the research I'm doing is making that a little bit more explicit. So the things we need to think about in terms of Wales, again, I think it's important these days with the devolved settlements that we have to see each nation as they are. In Wales, unfortunately, we still have, to quote the words that have been used in the Welsh Parliament, a stubborn problem with child poverty, despite action by the government, both in terms of legislation, policy and investment, to try and overturn or remedy child poverty. We have very high levels of that. We still have to cope with the sort of policy diktats of Westminster. That's probably a little harsh, but we have to work on those and understand how we can apply them in a Welsh way. I've put in the centre that red block, the Justice Commission for Wales's report. Good grief, in Wales we like commissions, clearly. In 2009, Professor Rod Morgan did a fantastic report on why we should devolve youth justice in Wales. That was followed by a Silk Commission report, 2014. And then the Justice Commission for Wales reported last year in 2019. There is some political will to devolve youth justice because, again, it can be seen as distinct from criminal justice. We haven't got there yet. So whereas you have full competence in Scotland, we don't. And that arguably is causing a few problems. Now, I mentioned that criminal justice isn't devolved. However, what is interesting is influence. Now, I'll quickly run through these. I'm not going to spend too long on context. If we look at the Welsh Government, our devolved government, the Welsh Government controls those things in the bubbles in the centre of the screen. And when we look at them, some of those powers, those areas of competence are really critical to youth justice, notably local government, health, housing. The Welsh Government controls them, and as I've said, we have a strong legislative framework which is pro-children's rights, so there's flow down from the Welsh Government. We've also been able to build good relationships with the Youth Justice Board, so there's Youth Justice Board Cymru as well as the Youth Justice Board that operates in England. And I would say, I'm not a Youth Justice Board basher, there has been an evolution in the relationship between the Youth Justice Board and the Welsh Assembly Government, as was in the Welsh Government, and progress is being made there. I think we have to be very open and honest and say that. We've got the powers around local authorities, councils. They've been proactive in trying to promote children's rights in their services. I was chatting earlier today with people. In September 2013, 7 years ago, in the city and county of Swansea, the council agreed to bind itself with a due regard duty. 7 years ago, it just seems really fast, but you can see over time how local government in Wales as well is playing its part to try and promote children's lives. And then we have the other services. Health, clearly critical for some young people who are very vulnerable, or for example, who have ACEs. And our PCCs, the Police and Crime Commissioners, again, as far as I understand, you don't have them in Scotland, but these individually elected people who have some responsibilities around youth justice. So the point I'm trying to make is, it's not as straightforward as things first look. There are lots of levers, both in terms of policy and resources. You know, Charlie Taylor in his report, when he was reviewing the youth justice system, made a real big and important point saying that he recognised that the Welsh Government had been giving grants and support to yachts and blending devolved approaches with youth justice approaches. More could happen, but we are limited, certainly in terms of what we do with formal sanctions and the way that criminal justice for young people functions in Wales. I just think it's important to say all this before I move on. I do want to say as well that all of that sounds really good. I'd rather give you an honest opinion and say, actually, there are still big questions. So I've given you a quote there. So this is sort of hot off the press, really. Within the Welsh Parliament, the Children, Young People and Education Committee recently looked at children's rights implementation in Wales. And if you look at the last line, which I've highlighted a little bit in blue there, the sad but realistic conclusion of the committee was children's rights are not driving the Welsh Government's decision-making as the legislation intended. We've got work to do. I mean, I said at the beginning, you guys seem to be overtaking us. We had great energy around the promotion of children's rights. Arguably, we need to regain that and move forward. You can see by this scrutiny committee in the Welsh Parliament that certainly the members have an appetite to keep taking this forward. I will say as well, so I just picked myself up there, we have recently changed the name of the Welsh Assembly to the Welsh Parliament. If I fall into the wrong term, please forgive me. I'm so used to calling it Welsh Assembly, so do forgive me there. Oh, great, here we go. Sorry. There you go. Sorry, that's the first IT faux pas. So again, putting things in context as well, we've got challenges in the way we see youth justice. So I'll start at the bottom left. The minimum age of criminal responsibility, it's still 10, which is shameful, frankly. I know in Scotland you've raised it to 12. I think there's an appetite, certainly in Wales, for us to raise it above 10. With the abolition of dollying capacity, we need to do something around that. But there has been positive reaction in Wales to ensuring that youth justice is appropriate. If you look just above the figure there about the minimum age of criminal responsibility, you have there the process flow for the Swansea Bureau, arguably one of the most innovative processes that's been created in Wales. Something that's been adopted actually by the Westminster Parliament and run out through LASPO. We do have a national commitment to children's rights, enshrined in legislation, particularly the Rights of Children and Young Persons Measure, which is the equivalent of primary legislation, 2011. And we do have other innovative changes happening. So in Wales, in 2021, we are adopting a new national curriculum. And one of the exciting things within that curriculum is that, yes, there's an emphasis on academia and learning, but there's also a massive emphasis on well-being, and part of that is around rights as well. And we have a very pro-rights education minister in Wales. Finally, I wanted to mention the welfare state again. It's noticeable, I think, that in some central government, by that I mean Westminster, the word welfare doesn't appear much in strategic or policy documents. In Wales, it's littered through legislation, through policy and strategic guidance. We're not afraid to intervene. We do, of course, have a different colour government to Westminster. We have a Labour government in Wales that may clearly be making a difference. I wanted to put this up, don't worry, there's so much writing, don't worry about it. I'm just putting this up. I will give the slides, obviously, to Charlotte at the end of this talk. I wanted to, this is our current flagship approach in Wales to youth justice. It's a joint enterprise between the Welsh Government and the Youth Justice Board. And I wanted to put this on the slide so you can take a look at it. I mean, as you guys are moving towards incorporation, this sort of approach may be something you want to look at. You know, trauma-informed approaches, ACEs, maximising prevention, blending different service approaches. I'm not going to spend too much on this today, only because I wanted to mention it because it is one of these evolving areas where children's rights have the ability to make a big difference within the youth justice system. And I always think of the system in Wales as a bit like a web. It's fine to delineate primary legislative competence between Westminster and Cardiff. In practice, things are very different. I spent over a decade of my life working directly in a youth offending team, one of the biggest in Wales. And I will say, and I have to say, that one of the things that was always noticeable there was, yes, there are legislative requirements, yes, there are policy requirements and standards requirements, but when you've got good practitioners who are well trained, who believe in things like children's rights, who believe in wanting the best for their clients, this whole web of services, of partnerships, of networks can be made really strong rather than it being a bit tenuous. I wanted to say that because I think seeing it as a web is important as well, because as we all know, you knock one part of a web, there's ripples throughout the rest. I see that very much in terms of youth justice. If education provision is poor, then arguably that will affect children, their propensity to get involved in criminogenic activity, but also it'll affect the way the children can be rehabilitated, supported, having families helped as well. One thing affects the other. It's symbiotic really in the way it operates. So to the things that you probably want to hear more about, what's happened in 2020? Well, the C word has happened in 2020, Corona. Still with us, still causing lockdowns all over the place. I think it's not an overestimate to say that probably the biggest crisis and disruptor to public services we have ever seen. And it is arguably something which has really caused significant challenges to children and families as well. I think we're only starting to see the consequences of the coronavirus. mainly because people have been locked down. Now as we're coming out and services are beginning to start again, we're starting to see the effects that this has had on young people and their communities. I wanted to give two examples of change for you, and these are based on empirical research, so it's a bit more current, and then what I'll try and do is give you some reflections about how I think all of this may have implications around rights, and again, how in the future, frankly, as Scotland progresses, how we can share as well good practice. So first of all, working in schools. What I'm going to do here is explain to you, and I must say this, I saw Claire's blog about the primary school she visited when she came down to Wales. Partly this is around what happened in that school and what people are now saying about the effect of the coronavirus. So I've called the school Welsh School Primary School for obvious reasons, to give it anonymity, but I wanted to explain, and this is relevant in the context of youth justice, what this school does. It doesn't simply teach children. I don't think many schools simply teach children. They do so much more for them. And this particular school is very high quality in a number of ways. If you look at the left of the screen, it's a rights embedding school. So it's been a pioneer, taking forward the rights respecting school program and making it something which is mainstream. It's not an add-on, it's mainstream, it's core business. A school that's been aware of what's happening in its communities, not simply about requirements around teaching and curricula. So, you know, the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation, looking at the scores of children, many of whom come from highly deprived backgrounds, but are encouraged to do well. It's a school where there is a significant focus on early intervention and prevention. For instance, the school has a family support manager, an emotional wellbeing and literacy officer. There are support mechanisms in the school so the school can hold and address problems rather than having to refer to local authorities or to other service providers necessarily. And then finally, the school is informed by restorative practices, partly restorative justice as well, massive emphasis on well-being and on being a community hub. To give a little bit more information, this is a school where there are very few local resources around them. The school is literally the hub of the community. It's the place where people go. It's the place where mums and dads and children seek support, and it's there for them. I put under those pillars, I mean, some of these things, yes, they have resonance with the convention. As you walk into that school, members of the centre who visited will tell you children's rights are everywhere, to reassure them that they have these rights and they can access them. And teachers make it clear to them that if they need appropriate interventions and support, it's there. I wanted to pick up on one specific change that the school has made and how COVID perhaps has made this vulnerable. And it was about behaviour. There are numerous studies that concern the way that behaviour at a young age, if it's not supported, if we don't engage in things such as restorative practices, addressing underlying problems, things get worse. There's the university, we work closely with this school, and year before last we had a research exercise with the children, with a new head teacher who wanted to change the way that the school did discipline. Number one, that term isn't the best term anyway. And so what did we do? We worked with the children. Now you can see on that picture, you can see 4 dragons. I will explain what they are in a second. The dragon is the school's motto, no surprise perhaps in Wales. But what the new discipline code was meant to do was a few things all at once. It was meant to help children be in the classroom, be happy, to resolve underlying problems and to promote academic engagement. If you look at the left-hand side of your screen, the foundation phase outcomes, you can see a drop, particularly 15, 16, 16, 17. And if you look at core subject indicator, again, you can see a drop. And the senior management team in the school saw a problem around children being suspended, being excluded. You know, if you look at data across where there is an issue around the exclusion of children. And what happens when they're excluded? Of course, the door was open in many ways to antisocial behaviour, disruption to their routine, to their education, and potentially family problems as well. So anyway, working with the university, my team, the children created a new system, these 4 Rodris, which operates on a restorative basis where children always start, children always start at their green dragons, they move up and down. So if there's Bad behaviour, children are given time out to think about it, they're not excluded, restorative processes are adopted. If they're really naughty, they can be referred to the head teacher. If they do really well, they're rewarded. Why is this relevant to youth justice? It's actually really relevant, and this is why. Look at the outcomes. So that school was predicted a 16% foundation phase indicator target. In the year that the new system was implemented, and I should say as well, it was implemented between the head teacher, the school council, lead teachers, and teachers were given specialist support as well in training. So from 16% to 32. The core subject indicator leapt 55 to 68. One of the most important points here on the screen, a 68% decrease in exclusions. Really unprecedented. So those children stayed in school. They had that support. They had wraparound support within the schools. And we saw a general increase in behaviour and education. Now, what's COVID done? Well, COVID has disrupted a lot of that. And I want to put some quotes there. These are from individuals within the school. So on the left-hand side, the head teacher, it's an investment. You know, by doing all of these things, the school is investing in the children to make sure they've got support all the time. In the middle there is one of the school pupils. People think school is just about classes, but someone's always there for them and they get to use their rights. You know, this is all based around their rights, their ability to speak to people, have their best interest taken into account, have their well-being supported. The last point I put here is more recent. This is this was taken during the sort of latter part of the lockdown. The schools had to turn up the power on its community role and shift provision. What's been really interesting talking to staff in the school is that the traditional or conventional basis of service provision in schools has altered quite significantly. And I've got a little, this is a bit crude, but I hope it gives you an understanding. This is not a graphic from Gallifrey, don't worry. What I've tried to do here is to, if you look at the center of the diagram with the thicker lines, those were the levels or the proximity of the support children were having when they were in school. So learning activities, really close to them when in school. Behavior support, welfare and engagement with staff. All of that was very close to the pupils, as you would expect. Underpinned by restorative justice, rights respecting approaches. Very powerful things. And what's happened during COVID are the thinner circles or symbols on the screen. So what we've seen is this move away from the child. And actually, talking to one member of staff, it's been interesting where there have been, for instance, mental health problems, some staff are now supporting adults as well as the children. Because with social workers unable to do visits with the local authority, being constrained by COVID regulations, the schools actually have been picking some of these things up. You know, I mentioned the school hubs. COVID has really, in my view, highlighted brilliantly or radiantly what schools actually do. What's important as well is those lines are there. They haven't disappeared. Teachers, support staff, the head, they're all there. The challenge, I think, is going to be, and I can't give you an answer yet because schools have only just returned with us. We will be following up research, and I will say here, my colleagues in the Observatory on the Human Rights of Children, particularly Professor Jane Williams, we're doing research right now to try and understand some of these effects and map them. We're going to have to see what months away from school has done to children. We're already getting some indications, but we don't know yet. Now, I'll come back and reflect on that a little later. I'm aware I'm taking a bit of time, so I'll move on to youth justice. What can we say about youth justice in Wales? Well, again, there is a paucity of data, but what is interesting are the messages that are coming out from youth offending teams and the Youth Justice Board. There is a really interesting report. I put the front page there on the screen, where we've seen, it's been reported to the YJB, that there have actually been increased levels of engagement between YJB Cymru, YJB Wales, and yacht managers. And we are aware that staff have been really good at adapting what they do to make sure that children get support and help at this most critical time. And statutory work and community work has been continuing, but it's changed. I'll come on to a little bit of that in a second. And also, I think time has been given for staff to reflect, first of all, on what they're doing and why they're doing it and how to do it better. I think we've all got to be very pragmatic with COVID. Perhaps it's a bit dramatic, but I think it's a watershed moment for public services. And talking with staff, some of them see it that way. That actually this is a chance to say, what do we do really well and how do we make it work best for our children? And for me, the interesting effects around a lot of this are these. Child-friendly approaches. Now, what I've been told by research participants is, first of all, children aren't that upset that they've had to move to e-communications with staff. Actually, because they do that on a regular basis, it works for them. So if we're talking again with Crime Disorder Act about local solutions, local needs and the best way of doing things, that may actually be one way of doing that. Secondly, there's actually been increased contact in many cases with children. Officers, rather than calling people to the office, are now going to their homes. They're getting to know those children a little better than perhaps they would in isolated statutory contact meetings. And it's about methodology as well. Staff are able to use methods that engage children really well. I've put a picture up there of a little park. It looks quite idyllic. That's Cwmdonkin Park in Swansea. And as resources across the city have been closed because of COVID, these resources are open. They're on people's doorsteps. And I know of officers who have been going to make children aware again of the things they can do in their community. A place that they feel safe in, a place they know, but a place that they can then meet their officers, talk through things, and actually make use of local resources. Then we've got issues around appropriate interventions. Now, I just mentioned the park there. What officers have also been doing is looking at how they can use community assets better. So I know one proposal that's being discussed at the moment is using, for instance, youth clubs for meeting children rather than, say, the Guildhall in Swansea or the Youth Justice Office. Again, if we're thinking about issues around labelling theory and stigmatisation, these are really positive things. And it's about developing that capital as well. Again, if we're thinking about children as stakeholders, as valuable members of society, they have a stake in using those resources and actually building them, building the capital that's around them as well. And also, finally, changes around access to justice. Now, I didn't expect to find this particular sort of finding in the research, but it's really interesting. Actually, by having things like online bureau, online meetings, what's coming back is actually it's destigmatizing and actually de-fearing, that's probably not a word, but it's probably a useful term. It's making people less afraid to engage in justice processes. They can do it from home, they can be prepared, they can be calm, they're not dragged into an unusual environment. It also means perhaps because mum and dad are home, because they may not be in work, because of furloughing or because of COVID or job loss, they are around as well, which again has a protective and preventative effect as well. So some really interesting emerging findings coming out from what officers are saying. And there was one that I found really fascinating. The youth justice system isn't just about the children, they're critical, it's also about the officers who help them. And I didn't expect to see this coming out. Actually, some of the officers were saying working at home, being flexible, having more time to think about the children, making ourselves more available outside traditional hours is a positive. So this particular officer, he said, you know, this may be an issue of harm reduction. You know, if I'm willing to let my phone be on in the evening because I'm working late, because, for instance, my family, I'm aiming to see them in the day and I catch up my work later, we're not stuck to 9 to 5 anymore. That child can talk to us. Now, that's opening access to justice. That's giving that child that right to information, that right to support. It's also, as well, if you look at the last 3 sentences or 4 sentences, it also signifies something else about community justice coming back. I've been around a long time in my local area, and I remember far greater emphasis on community level support and youth clubs and preventative programs in the community. Some of that has disappeared during austerity, unfortunately. We may get some of that coming back now because the officers aren't stuck in offices, they're decentralised. They're back in their communities, they may be closer to people. I like those last few words there. This is how it used to be. I hadn't thought about that effect on officers. And I've done the reverse here of the little map earlier. Actually, when you look at what's happened in youth justice, almost the reverse has happened. So originally, children were probably more disengaged from the system, just having to come to statutory meetings, wanting to engage now and again. Now, we're actually seeing, in some cases, stronger support mechanisms flowing around the child. And importantly as well, better relationships with their officers, because they may be in touch with them more easily, more frequently. And that's really interesting. More work needs to be done in this. I said this is a bit rough, I'm not going to lie. But for me, these emerging findings really are interesting. They're interesting in the context as well. If we think around things such as what General Comment 24 says about prevention activities and welfare and appropriateness, these are all really, really relevant things. And so I take a sort of neutral view in some ways of COVID, and that actually it's creating some really weird and innovative and different effects. So you've got things like, I just mentioned there in that little diagram, denial versus enhancement of Article 40 rights. Well, children, of course, they've got their Article 40 rights, but we may be seeing a much greater concentration on individuals through proximity in communities as a result of COVID, which may lead to fairer outcomes, may lead to better understanding of what's happening to children. Because the officers have got a little bit more time, and as I say, they have better means of communication through e-communication. There's an interesting shift as well with government and public perceptions of service shifts. So far, and evidence may contradict me later about this, the children aren't complaining about the changes. For some of them, it's quite welcome. Government, I know, is worried. We hear this frequently, government being worried about a lack of service provision. For the young people who are in conflict with the law, some of that worry doesn't exist, certainly in youth justice, because they are getting that support. If you look at the bottom right, in the orange bubble, I'm thinking of particularly the schools. There may be greater engagement with vulnerable young people because the web or the net of the school is like a radar. It's flowing outwards into the community, perhaps at a stronger frequency than previously. And again, some staff, because of what's happened with social distancing, may have a little more time to do these community things rather than being involved in the core activity of the school. And the last point, I've left it to last because it's one of my bugbears and excitement points. Are we actually seeing, through COVID, a rethinking and an emergence of perhaps more meaningful forms of youth justice? And this brings me back to my earlier point. I mean, I am sceptical about talking about youth justice in criminal justice terms. It is far more than that. It's about relationships, appropriate services, honouring rights, respecting young people. It's about a lot of things that we don't necessarily associate with the criminal justice system. So as far as the challenges are concerned, I'm summarising them at this point in time as these. First of all, there are big challenges to what children get because many of the things that work are relationship heavy and sometimes they work in institutional settings. Yet, when we look at youth justice, practice may actually become more focused upon developing relationships rather than processes and interventions, which can only be a good thing. There is a worry about the relationship of children with their rights in schools because of disruption. As we all know, we're all the same. Sometimes we need to be reminded of things. We need to be able to access things. We need to be able to have support from others to engage with our rights, our entitlements. It remains to be seen what the impact has been there. There's been a shift in support. That is unquestionable. Certainly in schools, I'm talking about the school I mentioned earlier, there has been poor take-up of school-supplied virtual learning and important schemes, particularly for those in vulnerable areas like emotional support, health eating, exercise nurture, they've all been disrupted. We're going to have to see what's happened there, but that certainly is a challenge. I've mentioned quite a bit about the office culture with yachts. That's changed, and the feedback so far is that that's a positive. And then there's changed behaviours. I mentioned redefining youth justice. There's also a way in which we need to think about the types of offences that children actually undertake. So at the moment, it's been very difficult to get hold of accurate data in specific areas of Wales about what's happening with children's crime. What we're anecdotally getting is that there have been increases in antisocial behaviour. Of course, we now have to see that in the context of what the coronavirus regulations say, which isn't necessarily what we would have seen before or understood before. There is also a social context to antisocial behaviour. We've seen sort of frustration, worry by children, not being wanting to be locked up in home. We've all had those feelings, I suspect. So I think we've got to redefine some of these things. And also, again, see it in the broader interconnectedness agenda as well. We're also where children have become victims of crime, and we're not certain of the levels yet. Different charities have published reports on this, and we are, regrettably, we understand that there have been a case of domestic violence, an increase in that, which is awful. We need to do more work on that to understand what's happened and what responses have been put in place as well. There have been shifts in routines, which is never good for children. Children need stability, and they need to know that they have support when they need it. I've mentioned fear and isolation, and there's also about the unintended consequences of people being at home, sometimes good, sometimes bad. So these are real big challenges for us in policy terms, and also in terms of understanding impacts on individuals. So I want to finish just by offering some reflections. First of all, youth justice. I'm beating my drum quite a bit today, I'm so sorry. I really think we need to stop and think about what youth justice is. Should we really be talking about support services for children? That's an argument. I must say, I'm not an abolitionist. I lay my cards on the table there. Working with the yacht for a very long period of time, I understand that there are some young people who, for the purposes of protecting society and themselves, unfortunately do need to have high levels of intervention by the justice system. But for most, the vast majority, they don't. And that affects, I would say, how we see youth justice. I mean, I've given you a quote there from Charlie Taylor, and I think it's a really helpful quote here. In Wales, the Welsh Government provides additional funding to yachts. So even though it's not devolved, our government here in Wales is doing things around that. And they've got devolved responsibility for education, health, wider services, and these they can play a significant role in promoting enhanced partnership work between these different agencies, ostensibly to create better services, hopefully at local level, that prevent and support children who come into conflict with the law. So there is, I think, a good argument about us reinvestigating what youth justice really is. I mentioned the blueprint earlier, and that does go some way, I think, to help move us to looking at, in Wales in particular, how we can blend reserved and devolved powers together to create a better youth justice system. I think the jury's out on whether we will have full devolution of powers. I mentioned there again, Morgan, Silk and the JCW, the Justice Commission for Wales. We've had no real firm commitment from central government in Westminster to devolve powers. I'm going to go out on a little bit of a limb and say perhaps the time is right now, and COVID may be that opportunity for us to look at this as we build services again following this crisis. Sorry to be a bit political, but there you go. Next, I thought I'd put a rainbow slide up. We've seen so many rainbows during the COVID period, and I've had a thought around this. We have 3 Ps when we talk about the convention. What we've seen, however, with COVID is actually a fragility in services and support and the language of rights for children. I mean, if you think back to that early slide I put up of Lynn Neagle, member of the Welsh Parliament, saying that government needs to do more. It's not clear really that everything has been implemented as it should be. I would suggest we probably need to talk about things like 3 Rs. So I'll quickly explain what I mean here. Reassurance, so reassuring children, their rights haven't gone away. Their rights are just as important now, and also making sure when we reshape services that those rights are realised. Secondly, responsiveness. Now, partly that's about Article 12, listening to children and what's happened during COVID. It's also about ensuring, as arguably has not always happened during COVID, that the rights to certain protections and support are there. And that we make that clear to children. I don't think we have, as of yet. And then finally, reliability. It could be argued that some of the language, some of the support, some of the efforts around children's rights have crumbled a little bit during COVID. we need to show that we are, as adults, reliable partners to those children, and that their rights will be reliably applied, not when it suits government, and not on the basis of, can we derogate from this? So I'm not suggesting we get rid of 3Ps. I'm just thinking as we move forward, perhaps these sort of words or terms are things that we need to consider. And then finally, one thing that appears in my head frequently as I'm engaging now more in research around COVID is that we have to always remember the dangers of not respecting children's rights. I began today by congratulating the Scottish Government on what it's announced. I remember 10 years ago congratulating the Welsh Government on the 2011 measure. Things have gone a little bit quiet since then, and you've seen again what that committee has said. I think there's a real job to be done in ensuring that we keep the pressure on. I say this as academics and as people who care about children and their rights, to make sure that the critical importance of respecting children's rights is maintained. I'm not sure government alone can do that. Others of us need to do that. And we need to be using our collective strengths, whether that's legal knowledge, policy knowledge, the ability to create appropriate research methodologies, to keep putting pressure on. When your bill goes through the Scottish Parliament, that will be the beginning of a massive journey. You know, in Wales, we're on a journey. We've got partial incorporation. We're on a journey at the moment. But sometimes people have got to be given a little bit of cup of tea on the way, or a bit of toast to keep them going. The energy flags a bit. And I think the devil is often in the detail, and the detail needs to be energized and it needs to be focused. It's easy to forget children's rights. In COVID, we've seen the fragility, and that worries me. Sorry, jumped ahead there. I wanted to end, as perhaps I should, with quotes from two children. First of all is a young person who was involved with a yacht. And I just mentioned that the dangers of forgetting children's rights. Now, this young person was involved in a statutory order, and he was a really angry young man because he felt that his rights had been shut off. They switch it off, you do as you're told, which is the danger of criminal justice. It's a compulsive, it's a hierarchical decision-making process, do as you're told. That doesn't sit well with the language of rights. And the last point in that paragraph, when people just do things, don't explain, don't hear you, get mad, so much for my rights. We need to be avoiding these sorts of feedback from children, particularly those who are deeper into the system. More positively is the quote at the bottom from a primary school child who talked about how having a sort of proactive, rights-focused school made such a difference to one of their friends. So this was going into the school as a researcher, talking, saying, you know, you want to listen to us and we can change things. Again, this is not about systems doing everything for children. Sometimes it's about empowerment as well and working with adults. And this is about this young guy who was having problems at home, not doing well. And then he got to school, changed school, and things improved. In this context, it was through restorative practices, through being told he had the right to be protected and safe, through knowing that if his family needed help, he could be a conduit to that as well. I know the last two sentences, they cared about him and if he was okay and was doing well and he was happy again. And if everyone did that, things would be so good. That may sound a bit asinine, but I think that's the sort of thing we should be aiming for as we look to improve prevention practice, improve harder level justice practice with children. Let's make things good for them. We may create very good outcomes as well.